Hey everyone, it's Kate, and today I'm going to show you how to make this quilted coat from start to finish. This coat is compliant with the Free Spirit Coat Story Challenge because I use the grain line Tamarack Jacket pattern, a Quilt Smart clamshell template, and fabrics from Free Spirit. But you don't have to participate in the challenge to make a quilted coat. You can use an old quilt, you can use fabrics from your stash, you can do whatever you want. But some of you are quilters and want some help with the garment making, and some of you are garment makers and have said you wanted some help with the quilting. So today I'm going to cover fitting, making the quilt fabric, cutting out the pattern pieces, sewing the binding on the edges, sewing the coat itself, and installing the snaps. One important thing that I'm not going to cover is sewing the welt pockets. If you would like to learn how to make welt pockets, let me know in the comments and I'll make a video showing you how to do it. Also, on their website, Grainline Studios has a 15 video series showing how to sew the Tamarack Jacket. It is thorough and wonderful, so I will include a link to that as well. You need a lot of tools to make this jacket. Here is an artful rendition of all the tools I used. I will include a link to all of the tools that we carry at the Confident Stitch so that you can buy them. Whether you're participating in the Free Spirit Coat Story Challenge or you just want to make a quilted coat, let's get started. If you're participating in the Free Spirit Coat Story Challenge, you'll need to use the Tamarack Jacket pattern from Grainline Studios. You'll also need to use a Quilt Smart template. We have 4 of them in stock and can get more. Plus, you need to use Free Spirit fabrics. To pick the 6 fabrics for my coat, I selected a favorite fabric and built off the colors in it. Maisie made a video showing all our Free Spirit fabrics, and I'll include a link to the video in the description below. Step 1 is making sure your coat will fit. This project is a ton of work and you want to make sure it fits perfectly. I ended up making 3 muslins. The first one was a size 16 from the extended size package, which is drafted for a D cup. It ended up being too big, and so I made a 14 and it fit, but as I wore it around, the shoulders kept creeping toward the back, and so I tried a small forward shoulder adjustment and that didn't work, so I ended up doing a round back adjustment. So my final muslin was a size 14 with a round back adjustment, and I lengthened the sleeves 3 inches and the body 6 inches. I'm going to show you how to lengthen your pattern pieces. The round back adjustment is a little bit complicated, and if you want to learn higher level adjustments, I suggest you check out the Palmer Pletch Complete Guide to Fitting or Jenny Rushmore's Ahead of the Curve books. And of course, I'll have links in the description below. Here's the sleeve pattern piece. I'm going to lengthen it 3 inches. First, I'll pin the pattern piece to this cardboard grid. I'll line up the grain line and the lengthen and shorten line with the lines on the cardboard. Before I start altering, I take a curved ruler and see where the curve of the sleeve is on the ruler. It's between 1 inch and 8 inches. It starts veering away from the sleeve after 8 inches. I'll put that aside. And now it's time to cut along the lengthen and shorten line. I'm going to move the bottom half of the pattern piece down 3 inches. I can make sure everything is even and straight by using the grid lines on the cardboard. I'm going to re-pin the tissue in place. And now I'm going to slide another piece of tissue into the gap and pin it in place. And now I'm going to tape it in place with 1/2 inch Scotch tape. I like the 1/2 inch Scotch tape because it doesn't gum up your pattern pieces as much as 3/4 inch does. So now the sides don't quite line up, and I'm going to use the section of my curved ruler that I measured earlier to true them up. First I'll do this side. And then flip the ruler and do the other side. Now I'm going to cut along the new curve, and I have a new sleeve piece. The beauty of using the lengthen and shorten line is that you preserve the hem. If you want to lengthen the coat and maintain the shirt tail hem, you'll definitely want to use the lengthen and shorten lines on the main pattern pieces. Step 2 is to piece your quilt top. You want to do your pattern alterations before you piece the quilt top so you know how much area the quilt top has to cover. I ended up making a separate piece of quilt fabric for each pattern piece. I'm going to show you how to make the Quilt Smart clamshells that I used for my coat. If you're using a different quilt piecing method, you can just skip ahead to the next section of the video, which is cutting out your fabric. Your Quilt Smart clamshell coat pack has enough interfacing to make 120 clamshells. I thought that was way too many until I started creating my clamshell fabrics and realized I will need 96 clamshells to make my coat. I'm doing clamshells for the whole coat, which you don't have to do, but 96 is a lot. Here's how you make the clamshells. Roughly cut each clamshell away from the rest of the interfacing. You can see that it's rough. You'll cut your fabrics into 10-inch squares, fold each square diagonally, and press a gentle crease to mark where to place the interfacing. Take a clamshell and align it with the fold. I'm aligning the circle and the dot at the top of the curve. You can iron the interfacing to your fabric at this point, but I found that too fussy because you could only iron at the little edge at the very outside. So I preferred pinning. You do want to make sure that the iron-on dots are against the fabric at this point. You'll want to pin at the top and then along the curves. I'm going to speed it up and pin the rest. Now it's time to sew along the solid line from dot to dot. Okay, at the sewing machine I'm going to shorten my stitch length. I'm also going to backstitch. You want to honor the curve. You may need to stop and with the needle down and lift the foot to let the fabric relax from time to time. The shorter stitch length makes it easier for the stitches to go smoothly around the curve. I'm going to speed up and finish this clamshell. After you sew along the solid line, you'll trim along the dashed line. This is a great way to sew curves because you don't have to clip and notch if you trim close enough to your stitching, which is easier and also more stable. After you trim, you'll turn your clamshell right side out and use a point turner or a Hera marker to coax the curve in place. I like to use the Hera side because I won't poke through the fabric. You want the Hera marker to be against the fabric and not the interfacing. So I'm just smoothing around that curved edge, getting it nice and kind of finger pressed. So I have one clamshell ready to go. I just have to make 95 more. After you make your clamshells, you want to organize them the way you want your coat to look. I'm creating a separate piece of clamshell fabric for every pattern piece. This is going to be the sleeve. By laying the pattern piece down, I was able to see that I'll need a row of 3, and then 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 3. I spent time organizing and reorganizing my clamshells, so I liked how they looked. You'll need to use your creative juices to decide how you want your coat laid out. Once you've laid your fabrics out, you should take a picture of them in case you mix them up on the way to the sewing machine. Another great way to keep your rows well organized is to bar tack your clamshells together. I've bar tacked right where the side circles are. Here is how it looks from the wrong side, and here's how it looks up close. A bar tack is just a zigzag with the feed dogs disengaged. So now you'll iron your first row to a piece of muslin. No one will see the muslin, but it keeps your top row from floating in the ether. The Quilt Smart interfacing holds it in place so you can stitch it. Let's go to the machine. I have a zigzag stitch selected. I've narrowed it to 1.5 millimeters and lengthened it to 2.5 millimeters. I also moved my needle 2 ticks to the left, and I installed my edge stitching foot on my machine. All right, I'm gonna back stitch, and I'm sewing right along the edge. You want both the zig and the zag to be on the clamshell. The one to the right should be on the edge of the clamshell. You'll have to experiment with your machine and your feet to find the perfect spot. You may need to stop from time to time with the needle down and lift the foot to reposition the fabric. I'm going to sew along this first clamshell, show you how to pivot, and then speed up for the rest of the row. Here's the bar tack I made earlier. I'm going to go 1/2 inch beyond it to the dot. I'll pivot there and head to the next clamshell. And now I'll speed up. I've top stitched the first row, and now it's time to flip it over and trim away the muslin and interfacing along this top edge. I always find trimming fabric away while I'm sewing it terrifying because I have cut into my project more times than I can count. In this row, it's pretty obvious that you're just trimming away the muslin and a little bit of the interfacing, but it gets trickier as you build more rows. So be careful to just cut one layer. I'm gonna speed up and trim away the rest. Okay, you can clearly see what I trimmed away from each clamshell. And now I'm going to turn it back over. Now it's time to position the next row. The bar tacks really help because they're at the circles. You want to grab the dot of the next row at the top of each clamshell of the next row and place it so it's just covering the bar tack on the row above. And you'll pin the clamshells in place. This gets easier as you add more and more rows, but you do want to do it carefully for each row. And after you pin all the dots in place, you just want to make sure everything is nice and flat before you press. And then you're just going to press that second row to the first row. And then top stitch that second row, flip it, trim it away. It seems like it will take forever, but it doesn't. According to the Tamarack Jacket instructions, step 3 is to cut out your quilt top, your batting, and your lining in the shape of the pattern pieces, and then quilt them together. But I was worried that that would skew the size of the pattern pieces, so I did it a little differently. I made a quilt top big enough to accommodate all my pattern pieces and then had a long armer quilt it for me, and then I cut out my pattern pieces. I used bamboo batting because we were out of the Thermore ultra thin batting when I made my quilt sandwich, but I would suggest using this Thermore ultra thin batting for your coat. So now that you've made the quilt, let's cut out the pattern pieces. Here is the pre-quilted fabric for the front pieces. You can see that I have 2 matching clamshells in the center here, here, and here. They are going to make it easier for pattern matching. I traced 2 front pattern pieces, a right and a left, which will also make it easier for pattern matching. This one that's on your left is actually the right front piece, and I'm going to line it up with the top of this clamshell, and it's going to go in between 2 clamshells here, be on the top of this one and this one. And then I'm going to slip the left front pattern piece, which is on your right, underneath here, because this is how my jacket will snap. The 2 edges will line up right there. I have marked where the top of the clamshells are on this pattern piece. And then I'm going to slide it over to my matching clamshells and make sure that they are lined up. And I have this line, which will be right next to this, in between the 2 clamshells on these other rows. And I'm going to roughly pin this in place. So when I sew my 2 fronts, the clamshell will start here and then finish over here and be like an unbroken clamshell. I am going to pin these better and cut out the entire project. I'll speed it up for you so you don't have to watch the whole thing, and then I'll be back and show you how to notch and mark all your pattern pieces. Something important to remember is to cut out one sleeve right side up and the other sleeve upside down so that you have a left sleeve and a right sleeve. You also need to remember to do your notches on your sleeves. The back of the sleeve cap has 2 notches, the front has 1, and then there's another one at the shoulder seam, which is not going to be halfway. Do a little snip. The seam allowance on this project is 1/2 inch, so just make sure your snips are about 1/4 inch or less. And snip your 2 sleeves. And you're going to do these same snips in your arm's eyes as well. And now I'm going to show you how to do the front piece. So here is the front of my jacket. It has a dart because I'm doing size 14 with the D cup. And what you want to do with the dart is cut out fabric in this little V. And then you want to mark the dart point. So the way I do that is put a pin in from the right side, and then I can flip it over and I can see where the pin came out and put a little mark there. That is where I will sew my dart. And then the front piece has a little snip right about here and a single snip here in the front arm's eye, and you'll be matching this up to the single snip with your sleeve. So you'll do that on the sleeves, on the fronts, and on the backs. Step 4 is making the 2-inch bias binding. If you're making a Tamarack jacket, you do want to cut your binding on the bias because it needs to stretch around the curves. You can do that by cutting your binding fabric at 2-inch intervals on the 45-degree angle, or you can make continuous bias binding, and I'm going to make a video showing you how to do that in a few days. Step 5 is finally sewing the jacket. I'm going to show you how to sew the darts, how to sew the bias binding on, and how to set in the sleeves. Let's get started. To prepare for sewing, I serged the side edges of the body and the shoulder seams, and I basted the other edges so the quilting doesn't come undone. I also installed a walking foot on my machine. The first step is to sew the darts if you're making one of the larger sizes in a D cup. If you're making a smaller size, you don't need to do this step. I'm sewing my darts through all the layers of the quilted fabric, which is not how Lengthen Studio suggests doing it. Their method of sewing each layer of the darts separately is probably better, but mine works as well. So to sew the dart, you're going to fold the fabric right sides together along the V that you cut when you were cutting out. Line that up with the tip of the dart, which you drew while you were cutting out. I'm gonna pin it in place in a few places, including definitely at the tip of the dart. We're gonna head to the sewing machine. The way I like to sew a dart is to pull out 6 or 7 inches of my bobbin thread. I also have a very long stitch length, about 3.5 millimeters. I'm going to start here with the 1/2 inch seam allowance and line up my bobbin thread with the tip of the dart. Now I'm just going to sew along my bobbin thread. It's great. You don't have to draw your dart legs. You can just sew along the thread. Here we go. Back stitching. Pulling out my pins as I come to them. As I approach the tip, I shorten my stitch length a little bit. I'm going to sew right along the edge so it's not too abrupt. And then I'm going to pull it out and leave a nice long tail that I'm going to tie in a knot later. Now it's time to press the darts. I like to press the dart nice and flat from the wrong side. Especially with this quilted fabric, you want to get it as thin as possible. And then from the wrong side, I press it down toward my belly button, toward the hem of the coat. And then I'm going to grab my tailor's ham, which is great for shoulders and lady parts. I'll get everything situated on the ham. And then press it from the right side. I press it pretty gently, add a little steam, and then let it cool under my hand. And I have a nice dart. My clamshell is a little wonky, but that's not going to bother me. If that would bother you, you can extend your yoke lower so the dart is completely in the yoke. I have sewn the shoulder seams and pressed them open, and it's time to sew on the binding. I'm going to show you how to sew the binding to the center front pieces because they are the hardest. You'll also be sewing binding to the hem of the back piece and the hems of the sleeves, but they're pretty easy. So I've started pinning right at the side notch on the front piece, and I've pinned it around the curve to a ½ inch from the center front. The ½ inch mark is important, and you'll see why in a minute. Let's go to the machine. All right, it's time to sew. I still have my walking foot on. It's not required at this stage, but I like my walking foot, and it does make it a little easier. So, and I'm about 3 millimeters for my stitch length. I'm going to go forward, go back a few stitches, and here we go. So I am just sewing in the groove made by my first pressing of the bias tape. It's a great guide for about a ½ inch. And if you need to stop and lift your foot from time to time on these curves, that's fine. Here we go. So the straightaway is going to be pretty easy. And at this point, you've got a lot of coat to deal with. So you will be stopping and getting resituated. All right, so here's the pin that's a ½ inch away from the center front. I'm going to sew up to it and back stitch. And go forward again and pull out my project, cut my threads, and so if you're a quilter, you'll be used to doing this, but if you're not, this might be new. So you're going to fold the binding at approximately a 45-degree angle here at the corner, and the binding will kind of be straight along the center front. And I have about 3 miles of it down here. And then I'm gonna pin it in place for demonstration purposes, but you don't have to at this point. And then you're gonna fold it back down so that it is along this edge and also along the new edge, and can pin it in place. And now I'm just going to start sewing on the new edge right at the top, and I'm going to make sure I have enough thread. I'm going to go forward a couple stitches, back a couple stitches, and line up my binding with the edge and sew along the center front. So I am going to go all the way up the center front and turn all the other corners. I'm going to keep the camera on and show it to you in fast motion. But that's the hardest part, turning one of these sharp corners. Now I'll press the binding away from the coat so you can see that I've sewn it on all the way around, and I'm just going to gently press it away from the coat, and then wrap it around to the wrong side. And I'm going to wonder clip it in place. And actually, I forgot, first I'm going to press it when it's over on the wrong side, and then wonder clip it. And according to Greenline Studio and their wonderful video on how to make the Tamarack Jacket, you can now machine sew the binding in place from the right side. I am not going to do that. That is really stressful for me. I find hand sewing the wrong side of my binding much more relaxing, whether I'm making a quilt or a quilted coat. So I'm going to go around and press the binding in place, including making my mitered corners look nice. I'm going to press it and I'm going to wonder clip it, and then I am going to hand sew it on the back, because it's going to go faster for me and it's going to be less stressful. So after we get all of the binding sewn on, it will be time to sew the sleeves. The sleeves are sewn while the coat is flat. So the first thing you do is lay out your coat with the right side facing up, and then grab one of your sleeves. This is the right side of my sleeve and this is the wrong side. And you want to make sure that you're putting the right sleeve on the right and the left sleeve on the left. And you do that by finding the notches on the sleeve head. The double notch goes in the back and the single notch goes in the front. So this is the back of my coat and this is the front, so I know that I have the right sleeve, the correct sleeve. And so the first thing I do is find the notch at the top of the sleeve head, because that gets lined up with the shoulder seam. So I'm going to line those up, right sides together, and I am using wonder clips because this is pretty thick. And then I pin or clip my underarm seams first. After I do the shoulder seam, I get it lined up over here to the first notch, because that's pretty easy. And then I go to the other side. This is the back, and I'm going to line it up with at the underarm to the first notch. Put a couple clips in. Where's my first notch? Oh, there it is. So let's get this lined up. And I'm pinning my wonder clips so that the flat side is against the sleeve. I'm going to put the sleeve down against the feed dogs when I'm sewing. Okay, easy part is done. Now we want to somehow connect this convex curve with this concave curve. And the way I do that is first line them up at the halfway point. Turn my wonder clip around, okay, and then go halfway in between those two clips, and then halfway between these two clips. So along the seam allowance, these two pieces of fabric are the same distance. It's just because one is concave and one is convex. It seems that the sleeve is much longer, but it really will work. It's a little bit of a slow process. So I'm going half all the way so that my sleeve head is eased in to the armhole. Once you get it pinned and you think that the ease is relatively even, it's time to go to the sewing machine. All right, I'm ready to sew. I have my sleeve head against the feed dogs. Even though I'm using a walking foot, the feed dogs will still pull the bottom fabric through a little faster. So you want the side with more fabric to be against the feed dogs. And in this case, it's the sleeve head itself. So here we go. I've got my stitch length at around 3.0 millimeters. And I'm gonna have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And here we go. Sewing in sleeves is just slow work, especially with a big quilted coat like this. So just go a few inches at a time. The edge of the walking foot is 1/2 inch from the needle, which makes it really nice. So I just have to watch the foot instead of down here. So, and I'm gonna stop with the needle down and make sure that my dart is still going down. And with this, I have my other hand is right there, and I can pull the underneath fabric to make sure it's nice and flat and even with the top fabric. You can always pin this if you don't have wonder clips and if you have nice strong pins. I'm going to make sure that the shoulder seam stays open, pressed open. Keep going. Make sure everything stays nice and even. You can kind of feel that the underneath fabric is straight with my hand that I've slid in the middle. almost there. I find that taking it really slow while I'm sewing means that I'm going to lift this and make sure everything's nice and even. Means that I don't have to do it a million times. Let's stay right here, and I'll check on the side that I wasn't looking at to make sure it looks like there aren't any puckers from, oh, looks like, well, nope, I think I made it. And then I'll look from the right side and make sure it looks good. And at this point, if I found anything of concern, I would rip it and re-sew it to make sure that there aren't any puckers on either side, but this looks pretty darn good. So it's time to go press. After you sew your sleeve on, it's time to press it. I have a tailor's ham here, and here is the sleeve and my coat. I've serged the edges together, but you can also zigzag them. Serging is nice because it can get rid of a little bit of the bulk, but zigzagging is just fine. And because it's a curve, I like to press it on the ham. And you want to press the seam allowance toward the sleeve from the wrong side. You can see how nicely it goes along the curve of the ham. And get some steam going. There we go. And just go all the way around. And pressing it in place, and then you can check from the right side to make sure it looks nice and crisp. I like to let it cool on the ham so it knows what shape to keep. You don't need to press too severely, just nice and gently. And your sleeves are done, and it's time to do the side seams and underarm seams. And I'll meet you back here after I sew them because they're really pretty straightforward. After you sew the side seams, step 6 is setting in the snaps. So the first thing you want to do is practice putting the snaps on a quilted piece of fabric, which you can see I've done here just to make sure it works. And then you'll want to measure where you want to place your snaps on your jacket. The Tamarack comes with piece 7, which is a guide for where to put the snaps, and I used it to put the first 4 snaps. I added a 5th snap because my jacket is a little bit longer, and I'll show you how I marked that. So I marked on the right side where I want this 5th snap. And then I put a pin in, and where it comes out on the wrong side, I marked right there because I'm going to want to see it from the wrong side to put the snap tops on. I'm going to set in my snaps using our snap setter tool. My snaps are going to be size 18 purl snaps in coral. We have size 18 in a variety of colors, and they work just fine for this quilted fabric. Here are the 4 parts of a snap. You have your snap top, your socket, your backing ring, and stud. We're going to start with a size 16 snap setter tool and add the size 18 tool adapter base. I've flipped my jacket around so I have the wrong side facing up. I'm going to put my snaps on. The first step is to put the purl snap in the purl snap adapter base. You're going to place it right where you want it on the fabric. So I have my little mark here and I can feel the prongs. And then I'm going to put the middle positioning bar on, and my prongs are right there. And then I'm going to put the socket on, and the socket should have the slits on the inner ring facing up. And put the snap setter tool top on top of that, and then hammer it in. I'm gonna push down on this bar and it's easier to pull up the other two parts. There we go, a beautiful snap. And you can test to make sure it's nice and strong, but there it is. So now we're gonna put our studs on the other side. Okay, you can use your plain old size 16 base for the studs. You're gonna grab your ring backing and put it in the base. Position that right on your mark. Kind of push it in a little bit. And then position the middle bar, and then put your stud right there in the hole, and position the top of the tool on top of that, and I kind of let it click in and pound. Remove it. You have your stud in. Make sure it's nice and tight, but it's ready to go. You'll just finish the rest of this row and your coat will be done. Congratulations on finishing your coat. It does take a long time to make a quilted coat, especially if it's compliant with the Free Spirit Coat Story Challenge. But I loved the process. I love the Tamarack Jacket pattern, the Quilt Smart clamshell templates, and I love the vibrant colors that I chose. Whether you're a garment maker or a quilter, I know you can do it too. Please ask questions in the comments. I can't wait to help you on your quilted coat journey. And also share your finished coat in the Confident Stitch Facebook community. That's where I hang out and I want to make sure to see it. You can also tag your finished coat Confident Maker on Instagram and I'll definitely see it there as well. So thanks for watching everyone, and bye for now.